John Barclay, and welcome to the Fatality Free Future podcast.
Hello, my name is Holly Ferguson. This is the podcast where we discuss the challenges and possibilities of creating a fatality-free future. In this episode, we're diving into governance and measurement, and we're joined by John Sibon, who is a recent member of the Barclays team, and we brought you in to bring robust methodologies to our business with your strong lean background. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you on board.
Before you joined Barclays, tell us a little bit about your background and what you've been doing.
I'm from a tradesperson background, dual trade, automotive mechanic and heavy diesel mechanic, in mining for the last 14 years, but the last 5 years has been spent deploying lean management systems across big business. So working with teams to understand lean business practice, deploy the systems within their workspace, and then provide coaching and support as they mature within those systems. So it's been a really interesting journey.
And how has your career progressed? What got you into this space?
Look, I think from a maintenance perspective, I was always heavily involved with looking for improvements across a range of different areas, whether it be efficiency, safety, productivity, and it just naturally lent itself to moving into the lean space, because lean methodology is all about improvement, doing what we're doing better, faster, safer, but it's more about getting that from a bottom-up approach. So everyone from the front line coming up with the improvement ideas and being a part of the solution, working through those improvements collaboratively.
Yeah, one of the exciting reasons when I met John to have him come and join the team is we do a lot of work in the safety space, the culture space, the leadership space, which is very similar to what you've had to do with your lean methodology rollouts, but there's a little bit more structure and routine to that process that I felt added a lot of value to what we're trying to do.
No, it's great having new perspectives and processes brought into the business, which is why we've brought you in to discuss governance and measurement today. What comes to your mind when we say governance in relation to SIF?
Look, I suppose when I hear the word governance, I'm thinking process, procedure, clear set of accountabilities. So making sure people are aware of what their responsibilities are, what they're accountable for doing, to ensure that we provide a workplace where significance and incidents and fatalities are a thing of the past.
Yeah, and I think that's very similar to what comes to my mind, right, around the processes, the structure, the accountabilities or the roles, those sorts of things. Yeah, and I think the part of this is something that I learnt, and I think I see as a part of that process. It's just that there's some transparency in decision-making process. You know, there's a process for us to go through that's a collective process that allows everyone to have input, but then also can see how we get to decisions.
And governance and measurement aren't just safety principles, they're business ones as well, right?
Whether you're business, government, whether you're looking at safety, financial, everything needs some sort of a governance process in place to be successful. And safety, if we're not putting in place processes, procedures, it just doesn't work.
While governance is really, really important, what do you see as some of the challenges of trying to get that governance structure process right?
One of the parts of setting up any sort of governance is having a baseline, but then having the collaboration with the work groups, having that consultation process to make sure the governance is put in place whilst being, I suppose, a structure that supports delivery of the performance the business is looking for, but that the teams are empowered to be able to support and also to come forward with improvement suggestions and continuously improve that governance structure to deliver safety for everyone.
I think that's one of the challenges of governance, right? Sometimes we create governance as a process of controlling things or doing things to people rather than actually it being a collaborative process to actually understand how we get better at things and how we manage things. And risk management is a part of governance, right? Whether it's financial or efficiency or safety. So, risk management sort of sits in why we have good governance. So I agree. I think, that's some of the challenges is, do we take the time to actually engage and collaborate with people around our processes and refine our processes and learn about our processes? And I think that's probably what I've seen from a safety perspective. Individuals come together and make a few rules, procedures and structures and then impose them on departments or impose them on people. We actually think good governance practice is actually that's more consultative, and that's a lot more involved around how we're actually going to effectively set up these structures and these processes and these accountabilities.
I want to touch back on that reviewing element. In your experience, Reviewing work practices with teams, what are some of the top factors to be effective in implementing improvements?
Much like when we were talking about governance and having an engagement and consultation process with everybody, for improvements to truly be successful, the frontline teams need to be engaged, they need to be involved, and wherever possible, get them to make the improvement, be there as a support mechanism for the team, and give them or empower them with the opportunity to make those improvements, because that way they own them, they're more invested in them, and they want to see them succeed.
And the reality for leaders when they're thinking about this, and our listeners when they're thinking about that may take a little bit more time up front to let the workforce sort of take the reins and look at the process and work the process. But longer term, it becomes so much more embedded and so much more effective. And I think that's one of the challenges we face, not only in safety but in business in general, is sometimes you've got to go slow to go fast. And I just find that a really interesting concept when we think about governance, right? It's sometimes we put these rules and structures in place because, it's quick and easy to then put control. But if people aren't bought into that control, and that's why we say at Barclays, culture eats systems for breakfast, right? So if you don't actually get, while you do that system and process and those roles and accountabilities, if the culture doesn't come along with it, you're just not going to get the level of control that you think you're going to have anyway.
So that brings me on to, what are the elements of a good business process? It's all those things you were just talking about and more, I'm assuming.
Look, the first thing that does come to my mind is that transparency and collaboration, right? I just think that's the first thing. I think the more transparent we are, the more trust gets built. People trust us more when we're being open and honest and sharing what it is we're trying to achieve and how we want to achieve it. So I think transparency and consultation's key for it. I think you mentioned accountability.
Accountability, ownership, absolutely necessary to drive any sort of a process.
Yeah, and I think making sure that people understand what our expectations are and what is it we wanting them to do within a process. So whether it's setting up the process, whether it's looking at improvement opportunities, tracking actions, all those sorts of things. So what are the roles and responsibilities that we want to hold people to? I know we use this term a lot, but I think integrity sits really, really heavily in this process, right? So doing what we say we're going to do, let values sort of drive a lot of this as well. It's not just about process, it's not just about action. It's actually trying to embed and have this process bedded off our values, whether it's honesty, integrity, fairness, whatever that is. That I think integrity is a huge part of this process as well.
Where does creating standards come into this? Once we've decided that we've got good things that we want to replicate, how do we go about standardizing that across the business?
Big question.
Sorry.
It's a good question. It's a big question.
Implementing standards is basically a way of locking in the value that you've got now. So if we don't put a standard in place after we've put these systems in place, things inevitably slide backwards. So you put a standard in place, you communicate that standard, but then you have to routinely review that standard. Is it still effective? Is it still fit for purpose? And have that review cycle in there to make sure it's always providing the value that it's meant to. Otherwise, we have these standards, we have these processes, and they, if anything, they just hold us back.
Yeah, and I think that's where a little bit of the measurement comes into this too now, doesn't it, right? So if we establish a standard, we document the standard, people are applying the standard. We've done that for a reason. It's either trying to improve reliability, or it's trying to improve efficiency, or it's trying to improve effectiveness or certain level of risk profile. So whatever that improvement standard's trying to achieve, we really need to be thinking about, well, how are you actually going to prove it? How are you actually going to measure it? How are you going to actually demonstrate that standard? Because you're right, if we haven't documented it, we haven't brought in, we will slip back. But if we're not demonstrating the value, people will start to deviate from the standard anyway, because they're not actually, unless it's an obvious thing. If it's a small improvement, some people don't always notice it.
A lot of your role here is looking at data. What can you tell us about what makes data a quality piece of data or a poor piece of data?
Data's a big thing. A lot of companies collect a massive amount of data, but they don't actually do anything with it. So we put all these systems in place to collect data, but we don't necessarily use it effectively. For me, I find some of the best data is data that's input by the person who is actually there, especially when it comes to health and safety. There's no point having someone completely isolated from a safety event recording safety data. Same with whether it be hazards, field interactions where leaders go out. They're the ones that were there. They saw what was going on. They were there. It gives us clear data that we can use to drive actions, drive improvement. Other good sources of data from instruments, machines, things that can't be error driven by human
manipulated. Because what
Yeah.
gets measured gets manipulated. No, so
Yeah.
keep going.
No, completely agree. Data that's driven by machines obviously gives us really accurate data. We can see it over time. We can see trends. We can see behaviours. With the movement we're seeing to everything going to AI, the use of AI to measure behaviours, measure ergonomics, everything like that. Anything that's coming from that where there's that reduced margin of error, quality data.
If data's been entered as close to the source as possible, it becomes so really powerful. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So I was sitting with a group recently, and incident reporting's where we get some data. Like there's been an incident, and we're putting data in, whether it's witness statements or those sorts of things. But I was seeing someone sitting at the desk filling out the incident report, and they asked me for my help around what they thought would be the inputs to why this incident happened. So they're asking me, why do you think someone did this, and what do you think this was? And I'm like, who are we to put that data in? Right, so that's a data source. So people go back and look at incident reports. But this was being done by someone who wasn't even a part of the work. So this was being inputted. It was data input for the sake of data input. And that was just really poor quality data because it's not actually accurate. It's not actually related. It's assumptions. The 2 points John made there that I think are really important is it needs to be those who are involved, those who are actually at that point of information and put their data in. It needs to be them. And that's why when we say observations, audits, inspections, investigations, we need to involve the people who are doing the work because they're the ones that actually know what's going on. I think the other part to that we don't always understand how important it is. Even at that point, you need a lot of trust for that data, to be honest, and especially when we're talking about safety. But that's the other part too now. We're getting more and more technology coming into the way businesses are operating, and using instruments or data sources to actually give us data is a totally new opportunity, especially when we're talking about serious injuries and fatalities. Some of these fatal potential events are process orientated, right? And they can be related to release of pressure, temperature, those sorts of things. So the more we can use instrumentation to tell us about that, the more accurate that data's going to be.
Now, what about lagging and leading indicators? Can you tell me about the difference and benefits of those in giving us a full picture when we're looking at data?
So look, lagging and leading indicators, we generally talk about them when we're talking about KPIs, and having KPIs or measurements is a necessary part of any governance system. There's no point setting up a governance system if we're not tracking, well, how are we actually going against that system. So lagging indicators, they give us a view of historical performance, historical data. It also gives us the ability to look at that historical performance, trend, and predict what could potentially happen in the future. Leading indicators are what are we actually working on proactively to uplift our performance. An example that I can think of would be we're tracking our first aid injuries at a site. That is a lagging indicator. Another lagging indicator that you can have connected to that would be, all right, what's the cause of those injuries? Maybe it's we're having a string of hand injuries. So the proactive activity that we could drive from that and be tracking for that would be maybe we implement a program where leaders are going out to proactively have conversations about hand safety or line of fire and keeping your hands clear. And we would be tracking how many interactions they're having on a weekly basis, with the idea that if they're focused on those positive proactive interactions around hand safety, we'll see a reduction and an improvement in our lagging indicators.
Yeah, and I think that's the whole part of setting up a good governance system is you would have a mix of lagging and leading, right? So you do lagging's in the simplest terms, probably measuring the outcomes of things, the actual performance outcomes, where the leading's trying to give you some information around a couple of things. One is what level of proactive activity are we doing, and where you can, sometimes you can measure a level of effectiveness within those things. So, how often people were using, what tools, how people, were managing line of fire versus, hand protection, those sorts of things. So if you can find a mixture of measures, I think sets up a really healthy governance process. I think when we rely too heavily on one or the other, so I've seen organisations rely probably too heavily on just participation type leading indicators, where it's just like how much activity are we doing, but not trying to understand, well, what are we learning while we're doing that? Are we learning about the exposures to hand injuries? Are we learning about these things? And I think that's probably the biggest recommendation for our listeners is really keep reviewing your measures within your governance process. And if there's lagging indicators missing, don't think they're bad. They're not bad. Add them. Make sure they're there because they're informative about past performance and history. We should learn from history. But yeah, keep reviewing your leading indicators. Are they giving you a good insight to are we actually effectively doing the things we said we're going to do within the standards we set?
For those who are listening who want to implement better governance and measurement into their safety strategy, what would you guys recommend? Where should they start?
I think the first thing that's important to start with is what is it you're putting governance around, right? So as an organisation, you've probably got a few different things you're trying to establish and manage. So it could be quality, it could be reliability, it could be customer service, or it could be safety. So I think it's just be very clear on what it is that you're actually starting with. And I think as John mentioned earlier, then it's about really defining what good looks like. This is the bit of work we've been doing a bit lately, trying to help organisations sort of define what good looks like. It needs to be something that drives alignment. It needs to be something people understand. So I'll go to safety here. And when we talk about a goal or a vision or an aspiration, we're not talking about catchphrases like zero harm. Be very clear on what you want good to look like. So it could be proactively looking and assessing and managing our risks in the workplace. So defining a vision that you want, something that's achievable. And then, as you said, it's then getting into the consultation process.
Yeah. So what does good look like? Where do you want to go? Then engage with the team and understand what are the gaps that we have in place now to achieving that. Then setting up the basic, I suppose, outline of what it is that you need to implement.
Yeah.
Set up some routines with the teams, regularly engage, set up a way of measuring and understanding how we're performing against those goals, and then continuously evolving that process as we move forward.
Yeah, and I think as John said earlier, it's about documenting that as you go, right? So you're establishing the standards, you're establishing the processes, the procedures, the structures, the roles, the accountabilities, the routines, and then eventually the measures that you're going to have with that. So for anyone out there listening, you've probably got governance established. It's not very unusual. It's very unusual for an organisation not to have some form of policy, procedures, standards. It's really just evaluating that. So is that actually the standard we're trying to achieve? And if it's not, then go out and start re-engaging with your organisation and start looking at, well, what's working, what's not working, what are the gaps, what can we do to fill them, what routines are missing, what could we be doing differently, and what does that look like, how often is that, who should be doing that? And then probably the last part of all of that question is, so how do we measure success here? How are we actually going to measure this?
Now, we love to end an episode with some takeaways for our listeners. So for those who are listening or watching, what are some ways that they can engage with their workforce, communicate these things across the organisation to make sure it's done right?
Depending on who's listening here, one is if you're a leader, it's really important to commit to the process. There's work you're going to need to do, and there's resources you're going to have to make available to do this. So getting access to people and all those sorts of things. So commitment's really, really important to be able to make sure that this process works. If you're listening and you're not one of the leaders in the business, but you need to help a leader in the business, it's spending time with the leaders to get them to understand the value of going through really robust governance processes and improvement processes, because leaders do need to understand. Sometimes you do need to invest a little bit up front to make a lot of gain at the end. So I think leadership commitment and understanding the commitment to time and resources is really important.
I think another really important part is having a compelling why. When you're communicating something like this across an organisation, you're trying to get everybody engaged and involved in it. They need to understand why we're making this change, why we're implementing this governance, why we're doing what we do. As a leader, good storytelling ability really comes in well here to really be able to connect people with that, the understanding of why we're making these changes, and be able to really build the energy needed to make any sort of a system successful.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think without the why and good storytelling of what this is all about, I think it could land a bit on deaf ears. So I think while having commitment's key, but yeah, I totally agree. I think the why and the storytelling is powerful.
It always comes back to storytelling, doesn't it?
Yeah, we've said it a few times.
John Sibon, thank you for joining us today on the Fatality Free Future podcast.
Thanks for having me. It was great to be here.
Great. Thanks, John.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fatality Free Future podcast. Head to our Fatality Free Future hub on barclays.com for more information and to access everything we spoke about in this episode.